All right, then. There's nothing scheduled for next time as far as online quiz, so I will let you know if anything changes with respect to that. Let me wrap up where we were on Immanuel Kant. Quick review and wrap up for this. We were looking for responses to divine command theory, to relativism, to moral skepticism, to ethical egoism. And one of the responses is Immanuel Kant's moral theory based on, bless you, duty, right? I have an obligation to say bless you when you sneeze. Do I? Is that a perfect duty? Do I have a duty or an obligation? I don't know. To be kind, to be nice, that's probably something that's important to Kant. The question is, does it meet, bless you again, God bless you, does it meet the high standard of a categorical imperative? Quickly, what is the difference between a categorical imperative that is a moral claim and a hypothetical imperative that doesn't, for Kant, meet the level of morality? Does anyone remember? Remember the golden rule? Does Kant think the golden rule is an example of a categorical or a hypothetical imperative? Is it a moral claim, or is it not really meeting the level of morality?
Not meeting morality.
Why not?
I don't remember. I just remember you saying it doesn't.
It's correct, because what is the golden rule, after all?
Treat others how you want to be treated.
Treat others how you want to be treated. If you don't want to be punched in the face, don't punch other people in the face. But when you think about it, as Kant tells us, that's not all that impressive. Why haven't you punched other people in the face today? Because I don't want to be punched. That doesn't seem to take into consideration the other person. It only considers you on one interpretation of that. It is an if-then hypothetical conditional statement. If you want to be treated nicely, then treat others nicely. Or the silver rule, as it's sometimes called, if you don't want to be treated unkindly, then you yourself don't treat others unkindly. So that's not impressive to Kant. That's not morally impressive. It doesn't meet the standard of a categorical imperative, and this is the phraseology of the first instantiation of the categorical imperative, and we're only going to cover two of them. In fact, your book only covers two of them. They all are interconnected. There's a total of 5 that he offers ultimately, but we're only interested in 2 of them, and they basically come to the same thing through different approaches. And the first, I have 2 different versions of it there for you. One is the same. The first one, I think, is almost verbatim quotation from page 221 of your Rauhut text. Act only according to that maxim, that principle, by which you can at the same time will and want to will that it becomes a universal law. Or another way of putting it, you should always act so that the principle behind your action could be willed as a universal law. If it could not be universalized, then it's not a moral act. It doesn't meet the standards of a categorical imperative. Categorical as opposed to hypothetical. I categorically deny those charges. That means in every instance, in all instances, and completely. Categorical means universally for Kant. And imperative here we mean a law, so to speak. Could you universalize the principle that it is acceptable to lie when you have a headache? Is it acceptable to lie to get you out of a particular jam? Right, his example of a lying promise. I promise to take you to the airport, but then you end up having a headache, so you break that promise. Is it acceptable to make promises and keep them except when you have headaches? On one interpretation of this basic principle, this categorical imperative, the first version of it, if you tried to universalize that maxim such that all rational beings would abide by it, Kant's argument is that it would lead to the undermining of the very principle. The principle of truth-telling and of lying would both be undermined. They wouldn't conceptually mean anything anymore. And it's not obvious how he makes this point with his example of a lying promise. And so there's contemporary philosophers. Honora O'Neill is a Kantian philosopher, so he follows Kant. Tries to give a better example to make this point clear. And I don't recall if I got to this far last time. But she gives the example of imagining the case are the attempt to universalize the principle that slave owning is morally acceptable. It's okay for me to own slaves. Is that a moral situation? Could you justify that? And the question is, what happens if you were to universalize that maxim that it's okay to own slaves, to own people? What does that mean? And he's not concerned with consequences in this sense. In contrast to the discussion we'll have with John Stuart Mill, the utilitarian approach, do this because it'll bring about these consequences. Kant is saying, do this because it's a moral duty, it's your obligation. And to fail in doing it is to violate a categorical imperative. What makes it a categorical imperative? That it can be universalized. You cannot, he argues, universalize the principle that lying is sometimes acceptable, that murder is sometimes acceptable. Or, as Honora O'Neill gives the example, that slavery is sometimes acceptable, because with slavery, for example, if everyone was a slave owner, according to the thought experiment of universalizing this maxim, what are the logical consequences of that? Everyone's a slave. And the two concepts defeat each other. It becomes meaningless. So, in the most broadest terms, if you want, the reason it's immoral to act in a way that violates a categorical imperative is because it's illogical. It's one way of putting it. It's irrational. Immoral acts are irrational. They're violating a categorical imperative. They cannot be universalized among other rational beings. Therefore, it is not a moral act. You cannot justify lying. You cannot justify murder because these violate categorical imperatives. And it leads to a contradiction, is the ultimate conclusion, if you were to try to make it universal. He puts it in different terms. You should keep your promises basically means, this is his one example. He doesn't give many examples. He says basically, my book is already too long as is. If you don't get what I'm saying, I'm sorry, too bad. There's not room for more examples. He actually said something like that. Any rational being in a similar situation should keep his or her promises. Now that is a universalizable principle. We can imagine universalizing that without contradiction. Whereas lying on occasion, stealing, murder, and so forth, all of these would violate the categorical imperative. And he says more about this. I think I've actually posted these slides to you already. Here's something else he says related to this, and see if it makes sense related to what we just talked about. Should I be able to say to myself, everyone may make a deceitful promise? That is, I promise to pay you back. I need money now. I promise I'll pay you back, even though I'm saying to myself, I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to ever actually pay you back. Everyone may make a deceitful promise when he finds himself in a difficulty from which he cannot otherwise extricate himself. Well, then I presently become aware that while I can will the lie, that's that maxim, that principle he's acting on in that specific case, I can by no means will that lying should be a universal law. For with such a law there would be no promises at all if we universalized lying. The movie The Invention of Lying, I think, touches on this, not explicitly referencing Kant, but it's a fascinating idea for a film. Since such would pay me back in my own coin. Hence my maxim, as soon as it should be made a universal law, it would necessarily destroy itself. In the same way that universalizing the maxim slave owning is acceptable would destroy itself. Logically, it's flawed. It leads to a contradiction. Now that's not very appealing to us who feel things. It would be weird for us to say, you shouldn't be torturing those children over there because that's illogical. I find that to be irrational behavior. That's not all that Kant is saying. In fact, we have another variation of his imperative. I'm going to skip that. And get to his categorical imperative number 2, which tells us more than just we're violating a basic law of logic. We're being irrational when we violate the categorical imperative. When we violate a categorical imperative, we are in fact treating other rational beings, other autonomous beings. I don't recall if I put this word up there before you last time. But autonomos, do you remember that? Nomos is law. Auto, self-lawed individuals. When you treat them, when you lie to them, you steal from them, of course, you murder them, you are treating other human beings, other rational beings, merely as he'll put it, a means to an end. If you remember that distinction, the ends is the goal, the purpose, the point. And there's other terms for that we call. Do you remember the distinction between intrinsic value and instrumental value? Did I cover that with you guys yet? So, and that has what's known as instrumental. These are important concepts that we'll see again with Aristotle. But there's a key term here, never simply as a means. This is in Rauhut as well, a variation of this, but always at the same time as an end. Act in such a way that you always that you always treat humanity, including yourself. You have a duty to yourself, to not harm yourself, to take care of yourself, to cultivate your talents and so on. You have a duty. Those are imperfect duties, as he'll put it. That's what we ended with last time. You don't have to be perfecting yourself at every second in the way that you have to be avoiding murder every second. It's a perfect duty to not murder. You should always not be murdering. You should always not be lying, as we'll see. Because when you lie to somebody, you treat them as a thing. You treat them as an object. You treat them, you objectify them in the sense that they become things. They become tools. They become resources or instruments without intrinsic value. So they become a mere means. I mentioned, do you know the phrase, or I guess people work at human resources, HR? I don't care for that title. I'm a resource, which sounds fine until you realize how it might be implied. I'm merely a tool, a mechanism, a means to get something else. And do you remember maybe I'm getting confused which class I've talked about, the philosophical hallmark card that I wrote to my mom for her birthday last year? I didn't tell you about this? Well, it has to do with this ends means discussion. If something is an ends in and of themselves, they have intrinsic value. What does intrinsic value mean? It's valuable in and of itself, not to be used for something else.
So would Kant think that a compulsive liar was like a sociopath, essentially, because they'd just be objectifying everyone?
I don't know that those concepts weren't around the time that Kant was alive, so sociopath, I suppose he would agree, given that concept now, if he understood those words. Yes, in a way, or you're just a horribly immoral person, right? But there's a difference. Sociopaths, I don't know what Kant would say to that, because there may be a distinction of freedom in that context, in the sense that this person is incapable of seeing human beings as anything but means to an end. That's a moral failing on Kant's part. Because that's, in fact, in many ways, that's the essence of morality, is to treat other people as ends in themselves. Well, of course, they're not completely ends in themselves. You're in class using me, I'm in class using you, you go to a store, you're using other people, but not merely as a thing. To make this contrast, imagine driving through the toll booth and that basket you throw your coins in. There you're using that basket merely as a means to progress forward. You throw the coins in the basket and you go on. It's a means to an end to get out. If there's a human being working in the toll booth and you throw your coins in his face, you're using that human being merely as a means. We talked a little bit about that perhaps with, we didn't get to that, with grocery stores and so forth. You're using people there as means, but not merely as a means. Because human beings, according to Kant, rational human beings, have intrinsic value, which is to say they're valuable in and of themselves and not to be used merely as an instrument. And this is why I wrote a card to my mom, because I don't like to pay for cards. They're like $7, $8, and the things that you could say yourself. The drawings aren't as good as theirs, but I do my own drawings. And so I wrote a letter to my mom last year for her birthday, and I started with something like, Mom, I called her Mum, just for fun. Mum, you're wholly and completely and utterly useless. So I started the card. And I said other things, I can't remember what. And then I got into a discussion of, and by that I mean you have intrinsic value. You can't be used merely as an instrument. You are valuable in and of yourself. Happy birthday. So there's more to it, but I can't remember. But you see the sense in which people being useless. You're not marrying the person for their uses. You're marrying the person for the individual in and of themselves because that person has intrinsic value. Now, there are all sorts of examples of intrinsic value. Getting an education, it has intrinsic value and intrinsic worth. But it's also instrumental. So you can have things that are both. You get you get an education so that you can get a job, so that you can get money, and so on. But then what do you want all of that for? To jump to our discussion today with John Stuart Mill. What's the ultimate goal that is valuable in and of itself? And according to Mill, the answer is happiness. What do you want to, and you can imagine how, this is how you can determine, does this have intrinsic or instrumental value? If you can't answer the question, what do you want that for? Because there's no other thing to which it's striving, it's not any longer seen as an instrument to get something else, then you've perhaps found something with intrinsic value. So why do you want to be happy? Is happiness a means to something else, or is happiness the goal? Do you understand? You see what I'm saying? We'll see about that, because that's going to be one of the arguments from John Stuart Mill, is that indeed it's happiness that is the goal. Aristotle later on will say something similar. Or rather, chronologically, Aristotle said it way before John Stuart Mill did. Now, there are some problems, of course, with this theory, as there are with all moral theories. It sounds pretty good. We should always treat humanity, all rational beings, as ends in and of themselves. Shouldn't lie to them, cheat, steal, murder, and so on. And there's justification for that given his categorical imperative. Part of the question comes to is, how do we establish what constitutes a rational being? Because that seems to be the moral grounding. Who do we have moral concern for? Well, those who are self-aware, rational, and free. Who might that exclude from our moral concern that we would not want to exclude?
Babies and animals.
Babies and animals. Yeah, I just saw this here from Earth Day, I suspect. Compassionate choices. If you care about animals, please consider not eating them. It's a funny way of putting it, but it's pretty good. Do you care about other humans? Then don't eat them. Okay? Or it doesn't even say that. It just says, please consider. Consider not eating them. And here you have a cat looking at a bird, a chicken rather, and there's a dog laying with a pig. It's cute. But it seems we don't really have any moral obligations to animals. Kant actually says that. We have direct duties to humans, because they're rational, autonomous beings. We have what he'll call indirect duties to animals. Mainly because if you're willing to harm an animal, you're probably likely to harm a human being. But it is interesting. I look at this picture, and it reminds me, and maybe I told you this story a while back, this pig here. In San Diego, I was walking down the street in Pacific Beach, and there was a guy walking his pig. He had a pet pig. It was dressed up. Clearly it looked like a pet pig. And a week or two before this, I had read in the news, I saw in the news that a guy had set his dog on fire, or a dog on fire, and was imprisoned for 3 years for doing so. Which, some of you may think, well, that's not long enough, or that's pretty harsh. It's just a dog, after all. But that was going through my head, that memory of that case, and I was kind of surprised about that punishment. And then I see this pet pig, and the thought flashes in my mind, very briefly, mind you, that if I walked over there and kicked that pig in the ribs, I could potentially go to jail or pay a huge fine. However, if I had a farm and I owned that pig, I can put it in a tiny little pen with hundreds and hundreds of other pigs and just have it wallow in its own waste, not being able to move hardly at all, barely seeing any sunlight, basically torturing it, and then eventually killing it and eating it and having the whole process subsidized by the government. I could do all of that, but I couldn't kick this one pig. What's the morally relevant difference between those two scenarios? The pet pig and the pig in a slaughterhouse. Yeah?
One has value to somebody and one doesn't.
Which has which?
the pet pig has value to a human, so it gets better treatment.
And the slaughterhouse pig has no value?
Not to any humans.
Well, we eat it. Not beyond food.
Yeah,
not beyond being
food.
food. Or being bacon. Or ham. But why does the pet pig have value? Just by virtue of being a pet. Why does this pig get saved, whereas the other pig doesn't? What makes one a pet and the other not? That sounds arbitrary. I guess
The emotional connection that they have.
What's that?
The emotional connection that the person has with the pig.
Right. That would be one too. Is that a logical and moral difference? Which would jump to Mill today. Should we give our moral concern to other things only to the extent that we have an emotional connection to them? It's an interesting question. Go ahead.
I mean, back in the day when animals were hunted and stuff like that, there wasn't any emotional connection because humans need to survive or whatever. And I guess in a sense, you can look at it now, it's being done more efficiently instead of having to run around.
Yeah, you don't have to see the pig that you're eating. I didn't mean to go too far into this, but this was in my face, so I was going to discuss it briefly. Yeah, you don't have to see. It's a little different. The food is prepared for you. You don't see any of the process. And if you did see the process, you might have a different response to it. But you said hunting for necessity. That's another interesting question. Pet pigs are different than food because we need the food to survive. So we have to use them. It's necessary to eat bacon. That's a tough argument to make. I can't be healthy. In fact, it sounds weird. I'm not going to be healthy unless I eat bacon. That doesn't sound quite right. Does it? I don't want to belabor the point, but we are dealing with ethics, and that seems like an ethical question, and Kant leaves it open as to whether or not animals ought to be included. And of course, there's Hank, who's smarter than a one-year-old baby, and yet Hank wouldn't count as having direct duties toward him, but the baby would. That seems inconsistent. There's the problem of conflicting categorical imperatives. You should never ever kill. Ever? You should never murder, let's make it clear. You should never lie. You should never ever lie. Is it always a category? Should that always be upheld? Or is there a counterexample to that claim? Is lying always treating someone merely as a means and therefore immoral? Or are there cases in which lying, in fact, is the right thing to do?
Well, in cases where your lie is gonna save someone's life or help someone, I guess.
Do you have a concrete example?
I would say something from more like movies where like in White House, for example, terrorists are holding gun to like governor's head and they're like, you need to lie on TV, otherwise you're gonna blow up the whole White House.
There it seems like the right thing to do is to lie. Yes, good. Or your spouse asks you, does this dress make me look fat? And if you don't have a candy bar to shove in your mouth so you don't have to answer, it's a commercial, then, yeah, but even there it seems maybe lying is unacceptable. In any case, there's a couple of problems where the categorical imperatives compete. You should never let someone die when you could stop them. Well, if somebody comes to my door and is trying to kill somebody else, and I'm hiding them and I haven't told them where they are, and they ask me, where is this person? I say, well, I'm a deontologist. I can't lie. They're in the basement. Go get them. I mean, that would be awful. It seems there's an instance in which lying is morally acceptable. And you can give other examples that are less or troubling, say, that are actually very common if you work in hospice care. A lot of times people talk about patients who are terminally ill. They're on the verge of death, and they think you're somebody who works there, let's say, they think you are their daughter or son, and they talk to you as if you were their daughter or son. Now, what should you do in that case? What do you think a lot of hospice workers actually do in that case? Do they tell the truth and say, no, I'm sorry, not your son. You're not going to be able to talk to your son again because he's across the country and you'll be dead before he gets here. I mean, nobody's going to say that. There's no reason to do that. And yet it seems it's a categorical imperative that's being violated when you lie in that case, if they ask you. And so we can find cases in which it's acceptable, it seems. Before I move into John Stuart Mill, there's one other thing I want to say, and it has the fundamental distinction between Mill's theory and Kant's theory. Kant's theory has nothing to do with the consequences, other than the logical ones. You follow the duty. You follow your duty to do what is right because it is right, and you know it is right because failing to maintain it is to violate the categorical imperative. It's intention. It's the will. And I'll give you an example to demonstrate this. It seems commonsensical. Our moral intuitions are piqued here, where he says, or we can imagine, I see you. Let's say I'm trying to mug you. I'm trying to take money from you. That's my intention. That's my will. And as I shove you to the ground to take your money, a potted plant falls from the terrace above. Huge one. And it would have killed you had I not pushed you. And you recognize that and say, oh my God, you saved my life. And you take all the money out of your wallet and hand it to me. And I say, oh, no. Okay, and I take it. I get everything I wanted, and you have your life. The consequences are great. But your intuitions probably tell you, something's wrong there. Imagine you find out later, I was trying to mug you. Funny story. When I knocked you down, I wasn't really intending to save your life. I had no idea there was a potted plant. I was trying to mug you. Friends still? I mean, how would that even work? Wouldn't you find that to be strange? Wouldn't you say, oh, really? That's awful. What's wrong with you? Isn't it still immoral? That's what Kant wants to say. It is still an immoral act, even though the consequences were positive for everyone involved. However, if we take this so far and say the consequences don't seem to matter at all, there seem to be a number of problems with this, some of which we've already discussed, where, where we leave out one of the most obvious and commonsensical views of what makes something right or wrong. Because here's an example in law. Let's say I try to kill you, but I fail. It's attempted murder. What's the punishment for that? It's pretty severe. Why is the punishment greater if it's a successful murder? The intentions are the same. But our legal system seems to be built up upon a combination of both Kant's deontology, at least Kant's theory of virtues being something that are based on will, and utilitarianism based on consequences. But do you see a difference between those instances, morally speaking? What is the difference between attempted murder and successful murder, aside from the accidental feature of the consequences? Why are there moral distinctions between the two? Or are there? That's an actual question. Should the punishment be the same for attempted and success? And they don't call it successful murder. They just say murder. Should the punishment be the same? Because?
Because the intention is still the same, whether they whether it worked or not, there's still the same intention.
That supports Kant. And do you disagree?
Yeah, because the person that you tried to kill is really suffering, right? Out of fear that you'll try to kill them again.
Right.
So maybe it should be a worse punishment.
So attempted murder should be punished more harshly than successful murder.
Yeah.
Never heard that one before. That's fantastic. I mean, I don't know, it's fantastic. It's very interesting. Very interesting. Attempted murder is worse. If you're going to try and kill somebody, for your sake, you better do it right. Because the punishment's more severe. That's interesting.
I want to say no, because I feel like there's a limit. Yeah, you can say I want to kill you, but you haven't crossed that line of actually killing them. So I feel like it's really hard to prove.
Oh, but you tried. You shot at them and missed. You stabbed and they survived. And by the way, sorry, but every single example I'm going to use today having to do with ethics is horrible. Something horrible happens in it, just so you know. So let's go back to it. I'm stabbing you and you survive. I'm still trying to kill you. Right? So
I still want to say no.
that it's not equivalent.
Yeah, I still want to say because you did it, I feel like you didn't succeed. So I still feel like the punishment isn't the same.
Shouldn't be the same. Because you're not as good. If you were a better murderer, your punishment would be more severe. Yeah, interesting, yeah?
Yeah, I agree with that. Because, something could look like attempted murder to the police and to a jury. But for me, I knew exactly where I was stabbing them. and wouldn't kill them.
That's a tough one, yeah. Did you intend to murder this person? No, just scare him. You stabbed him 35 times. I really wanted to frighten him. But I knew just where to stop. That's
There's
tough.
also instances where people like shoot people and they're like, oh my god, I actually shot them, and then it's just like I didn't mean to do that. And it's like,
Yeah, that's hard to,
so I feel
exactly.
like-
That's tough to prove the intentions, but that's,
Yeah, so I feel like where someone's state of mind is, like they're like, yeah, they tried to, but they still didn't succeed.
but we could go the other way too and say, I can't believe I shot that person, I didn't want to, and then they end up dying. Still, the moral dilemma should be the same,
Yeah.
because they didn't really intend to do it or something like that. But the consequences were that they're dead,
Yeah.
and now we have the moral dilemma.
Would that be manslaughter, not murder?
If you can prove that their intention wasn't, that's exactly right. And that's a tough one. And I have, my old epistemology professor has an example of, maybe I already gave it to you, of causes and reasons related to this. I'll get to in a second.
I was gonna say, I feel like now the moral dilemma is tougher too because I mean, almost everywhere in the U.S. thinks someone can have a gun, and there's so many stories of like someone thinking that the person is breaking in,
Oh.
it's really their son coming home.
Yeah, quite a few of
It's
those.
tougher there.
That's true. It's harder to accidentally kill somebody with a knife.
Yeah.
I didn't know the knife was that sharp, but you did it again 35 times. I mean, with a gun, it's just one pull, and that could be
I
it.
think it's also like weird. We're talking about like a lot of different things, like if they didn't mean to or whatnot. But I think the point of the word attempt means you had a will to carry
Right.
out this action and successfully or succeed in it. So attempted murder should be just as bad as murder because if all things had gone right, they would be dead and you'd be happy about it. So I think
Yeah.
attempted murder.
The
going
word
off of
attempt. Yeah.
You want to be successful in your action is just as bad, but you
Yeah.
just somehow didn't pull through with it.
There's a
So, but yeah, if it was an accident you didn't mean to, then it's not really.
Then you wouldn't say
attempted
attempt,
murder.
yeah.
It's an accident. That's
it'd be like
different.
walking and not tripping. I attempted to trip. What? That's a weird way of putting
Yeah,
it.
so it's like it's kind of same, but if it's an accident, then it's not really attempted murder.
Right, there's
If
no
you didn't
attempt.
attempt to murder them, you're just like, oh god.
Back
I
to
accidentally stabbed you 35 times.
yeah.
That's not the
I
same.
fell down and so there's a great analogy to this with James Rachels, who talks about the distinction between omission and commission. In fact, it's referred to as the sin of omission. That's where I leave something out on purpose. Is that as bad as committing a lie? Is murder worse than intentionally letting someone die? Here's the example he gives, James Rachels, to show that, and from his perspective, that they are not morally different. Letting someone die and murdering them is the same thing on Kantian grounds. So this guy stands to gain by having a child killed for whatever reason, the uncle, nephew, whatever. Again, awful scenario. The kid's playing in the tub. The man has the intention of killing him. Goes in, commits the murder. That's scenario 1. Scenario 2, everything's the same. Intention to kill. Goes in to kill him, but the kid's playing roughly, whatever, hits his head, falls into the water, and the man just sits there and waits. The child dies in the water. Which is worse?
Murder.
Because of the consequences?
No, because he like went out of his way and used his energy to make something happen. And the other one, it's still awful, but he didn't exert any energy or extra force to make something.
What if what if the way of murdering the child was just pushing a button? That doesn't take any energy, just...
But it was still something that he did. Like had he not been there, that would never happen.
What if, let's see, and he, in the second scenario, the child would have drowned regardless of whether the man was there. Interesting, yes?
But it's still like, with him going in to kill him, he had the idea, I want to kill this child.
Yeah.
And then he goes in and he's already dying. He's like, oh, I should save him. But he doesn't have that. He's like, I want you to die. Die. Like,
Right,
he's
right.
waiting. The attempt and the will is still there.
That's the Kant
It just
view.
got easier on his part. Because he could have stepped in, just like he could have murdered the child. There was effort there.
Yeah.
He could have put in the effort to save him. He did not. It's like that omitting the part of
That's right.
saving him. So it's
It
still
doesn't
like
matter
saving
though,
him.
when you're persecuting for thought crime, it doesn't, you
Well,
can think whatever you.
That's true. There's the legal ramifications, and there are practical reasons why we would say it's going to be harder to prosecute the person who's thinking of killing the person, and then we have to get into the mind of that individual, and that's not going to be easy to do. So legally, that's a problem. Morally, the thought experiment, we're imagining we know what the intentions are. And so that's, his argument is that they're morally equivalent if we could establish the intentions.
It's also kind of like free will. Like you have deep self-compatibilism. No one can really know if you're acting on your own free will. You do. Do you have less free will because no one else can see it? Or are you just as guilty for no one knowing that you really wanted to kill this person? It's kind of the same.
Yeah.
Do I have less free will because you cannot see my actions? Or am I less guilty because you cannot see my intentions?
Good question. This is why a version of divine command may make a lot of sense, because there is a divine commander that knows your intentions and that will all be made sense of in the end, whereas human justice seems to be insufficient.
So would it be like, would I be in trouble like to scale it down a little bit if I saw someone driving on the road who's clearly drunk and they're like swerving between lanes and I decide, they're probably gonna be home, I'm not gonna call, but they end up taking out like 3 families or something like that with their car, would I be morally responsible for not taking action and calling the police on them? Because I knew that it was a high likelihood of something happening.
It's too much work. So Kant has a phrase called ought implies can. The moral ought implies that you're able to do it, and there's a lot built into that. If I'm late to class, I think the example I gave before is, and there's a child drowning in a puddle of water, and all I have to do is walk over and just lift the kid out and then go to class, I ought to do that. Even if it means me jumping into the pond and getting wet and ruining my $700 shoes and my $9,000 pants, still, those very expensive bits of clothing are nothing in comparison to this child's life. And it doesn't take a lot. If you is that and we would say you should have helped that child since you could have. If it's somebody drowning, somebody calls me and says, "Hey, Professor Kramer, there's somebody drowning in China right now," which, again, this is awful, but probably somebody is. Somebody in the world, out of the 7 billion people, somebody's drowning this second. As horrible as that sounds, I guarantee it's happening. I know, I thought one is bad enough, but it's true. It's awful. The world is horrible. And yet, are we morally obligated to go find them and save? We can't. That's too much. But if they're right in front of us, and we're able to do it, we should. Kitty Genovese, the woman who was stabbed 35 times over I don't know how many times she was stabbed. There were 35 witnesses who did nothing. Do you remember this example? We may have touched on this. None of them called the police. Even that, nobody even called the police, which didn't take much effort, right? You can even do it anonymously. And now we have cell phones. Here would be the argument. How much effort would it take? How much lack of convenience and so on would it take you to call somebody swerving? And would you do this for the sake of the potential victims, or even, as Lincoln put it, for your own sake, your own conscience? I'd feel terrible if this guy actually got into a wreck and killed people and I didn't do anything about it, where I could have at least tried. And so there you see a couple of approaches there. Kant would say that you ought to, insofar as you can. And with cell phones, you should pull over and then call, because you don't want to be unless it's hands-free. And if I'm a utilitarian, we'll see similar approaches to that case. Now, what's the difference between utilitarianism and, let's say, Kant's theory? Well, the goal is all about consequences. And the consequences have to do with accumulating, at least for the first philosopher who starts this concept of utilitarianism, which is Jeremy Bentham. He's a precursor to John Stuart Mill. How do I know what the right thing to do is? Well, it's whatever's going to bring about the best consequences. It requires anticipation of all sorts of things. What will bring about the greatest good for the greatest number? Or sometimes it's called utility. That's where utilitarianism comes from. Bless you. And notice the 2 different parts. The greatest good for the greatest number. It isn't always the case that it's going to do that which will help the most people. It could be the case that you should do that which will bring about the greatest good, which may help fewer people and may cause some harm to a multitude of others. As long as that harm to the multitude of others is outweighed by the greatest good for the fewer individuals. You might say taxing the vast majority of the populace does cause them some bit of harm, but the positives to a smaller subset of the population outweighs that harm, for example. And utilitarianism is something that's brought on, that comes about through the legal and moral thinking of Jeremy Bentham, who is a friend of John Stuart Mill's father. Bentham, in law and ethics, recognizes that at the time he was writing, maybe things haven't changed, but the laws and the codes of conduct seem to always apply unequally to those with power and money versus those without. Those without money had very little resources in defending themselves if they were accused, whereas those with a great deal of money had infinite resources, basically. And the law was not treating each individual equally. Instead of determining what is right and wrong based upon how it will affect every rational being, the morals and legality of the day was basically whatever helps those in power and those with money. Luckily, things have changed completely today. That was sarcasm. And so Bentham wants to expand on this and say we ought to determine what is right and what is wrong based upon how it affects all people. How can we help the most people possible? How can we accumulate, if you want, or maximize? He'll call it happiness, but he uses pleasure more often than not. Based upon this notion that we see, it's not new to Bentham. It goes back to the hedonists 2,000 years prior to Bentham, 2,700 years prior, actually. Nature is put under the governance, put man under the governance of two masters, pleasure and pain. We see this with influencing Sigmund Freud as well, with his pleasure principle. And so here we see a way of determining what's the right thing to do. Well, whatever will maximize pleasure, according to Bentham. There he is. That's him today, in his auto icon at University College London. In his will, he decreed that he would be wheeled out for all board meetings. This is actually his body. His head, I believe, is a wax head now because fraternities, of course, stole the actual one, because that's what fraternities do. You have to do that. Else you're not really a fraternity. You have to steal Bentham's head. And that's kind of disgusting. Let's move on. And so Bentham came up with a means, you don't need to get all this down, but it's fascinating, a means of calculating pleasures. How do I know what to do? Well, that which will bring about the greatest amount of good for the greatest number, the greatest amount of pleasure. How do I measure that? Well, how intense is the pleasure that is brought on? And how many people does it bring about for them? How long does the pleasure last? What is the likelihood that the pleasure will come about? The propinquity and fecundity, these words aren't used anymore, these fantastic words though. How soon will it be that the pleasures will arise? How likely will it increase greater happiness, expand on the pleasures? And there are other areas too in his hedonic calculus or philosophic calculus. Felicidad in Spanish is happiness, so there's a kind of way of calculating it. And you might say, well, this is absurd. You can't calculate pleasures. You can't quantify happiness. But you do with pains. What happens when you go to the doctor and you say, I'm in pain? And the doctor says, how bad is the pain? You say, I don't know, hurts. And then what does the doctor say? On a scale of 1 through 10, or for kids, when you take my kid to the doctor, they can't read yet, so they have pictures. And there's a smiley face, and then a little frown, and then a bigger frown, and then an extreme frown, then crying, and then blood and vomit. No, I'm kidding. That's the last one. Well, how's the pain on this scale? And in that way, you are measuring something in a way. Granted, there's some leeway as to how accurate that's going to be. But Bentham's point is, we ought to determine what is right and wrong based upon the consequences of the actions, and who it affects, and how it affects them. Not the wealthy, but everyone involved. The greatest good for the greatest number. Not the greatest good for you, not the greatest good for your family, not the greatest good for your nation. The greatest good for the greatest number. And that includes, for Bentham, animals. Can animals feel? Can they suffer? If so, they ought to be included in our moral concern. Bentham was adamant about this. Does the suffering of all the thousands and millions of pigs get outweighed by the benefits of eating them? According to Bentham, no. Because the benefits are taste and what else? We're back to that earlier question. No, I gotta eat bacon. You don't have to eat bacon. Some people don't eat. In fact, some people eat fake bacon. Bacon? Is that what it's called? It's got to be. Also known as blasphemy. Right. Is taste the arbiter of what is acceptable as far as eating? That'd be weird, because it could be that infants are tastier than bacon. And if so, you got to eat the bacon. I'm sorry. The baby bacon. All right. Forget that. I'm sorry. But if that's the argument, you got to eat it because, it's right to eat them because they're so tasty. What if an infant's really tasty? If tastiness is our determination, we're in trouble. If intelligence is the determination, well, the pig is smarter than an infant. If capacity to feel, well, that's a little different. That makes it tough. Mill's going to expand on Jeremy Bentham and make his argument less about feelings and pleasure and more about happiness in general, as we're going to see. Here's John Stuart Mill. His father, as I said, was a friend of Jeremy Bentham's. Actually got the younger Mill here to edit a lot of the works of Bentham. Actually, John Stuart Mill's dad was a bit of a dick. He made John Stuart Mill do logic and philosophy and math and Greek and Latin at like 4 and 5 years old. He read all of Plato in the original Greek by the age of 7 or 8, which means he had no childhood at all. Miserable life. Here he is at 15. Just absolutely horrendous. People looked older than they really were back then, that's why. But he had a nervous breakdown around 20. Actually, I think causally related to editing the works of Bentham. And then it was after reading some poetry from Wordsworth, I think, that got him back onto his feet and willing to continue living. And he responds to those who attack his brand of utilitarianism and confuse it with Bentham's, which is basically accumulate pleasures for everyone. Accumulate as much pleasure and avoidance of pain as you can. To some, that sounded like a pig philosophy, to which Mill responds, no, it isn't simply a matter of do all that you can that is pleasurable, and then you'll be happy, or do all that you can that will increase pleasures as such, and then we've done the right thing, because as Mill will put it, there are different kinds of pleasures, different kinds of things that bring happiness. His quote, "It is better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a pig or a fool satisfied," is making that point, which is a little subtle here. Socrates knows what it's like to enjoy the pleasures of the flesh, that the pig knows. The pig has no idea about the pleasures of reading Plato's dialogues. And maybe he'd say the same about the fool. It's better. Who would choose to live a life of a pig, knowing that you would be happy, as opposed to living the life of a human, knowing that you're going to be dissatisfied? Would anyone choose the pigly life? You would? Okay, one person? 2 persons? Mill thinks nobody would. Maybe he's mistaken. And it'd be interesting to see what argument would be given. I'm going to skip that. Part of the allure and benefit of utilitarianism is that it's impartial, or it's meant to be. Do that which will bring about the greatest good for the greatest number. And there are different kinds of pleasures for some that they, if you want, he calls them higher and lower. The pleasures you seek from, listening to Bach is a higher pleasure, Mill would say, than listening to something else. Bieber? Or listening to a philosophy class, even though it may cause a little bit of discomfort. The pleasures of a philosophy class that eventually come from it are superior to the pleasures of watching Jerry Springer, or is he still in the air, Jerry Springer? Do you know who the guy? brings people on so that they fight and determine who's the daddy or who's the father, whether or not the paternity test comes out, and then people throw chairs. Oh, forget that one. That's too dated.
He's still on the air.
Oh, he is?
Yeah.
Okay, there's the example then. Jerry Springer. One of the Real Housewives of Who the Hell Cares. Those shows, they're pleasurable. I mean, they really are. I've seen the one of New Jersey. Every time I watch that somebody gets into a fight, it's totally contrived. There's no way that human beings actually live that way. It would be impossible. They would all have heart attacks. It's acted out, but still, it's great television. But the pleasures are fleeting. It's like the pleasures of drinking, I don't know, really crappy wine. Actually, that's part of the point. You might say a pig philosophy is eat, drink, and be merry. Eat as much as you want. Do as many drugs as you want. Because that's the point of it. Be happy. Be pleasurable. No. Because if you drink too much, what happens? It's not as pleasurable. You have a hangover the next day. A utilitarian is going to argue the consequences matter. It isn't simply the consequences in that second, it's the consequences that are expanded to those around you and to yourself in the future. I'm going to skip that. There's a lot I'm going to skip here, I'm afraid. I'm going to come back to the happiness machine. But I want to expand on this thought experiment. Expand on the benefits and negatives of utilitarianism. It's almost commonsensical that utilitarianism is a moral theory that makes sense. And in so many cases we can appeal to it and say, the ends justify the means. President Bush spoke in these terms when he justified going into Iraq in 2003. The ends, bringing about safety for the American people, because that was the first reason for going in there, by the way. Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, had direct link to 9/11. That was the argument. That turned out to be not true. So we had another one. The ends, the goal, the purpose of going into Iraq in 2003 was freeing the Iraqi people from a dictatorship and a horrible person, and that was the case of Saddam Hussein. And that was the goal. And what is the means to bring that about? Horrible, horrible military force, where it is inevitable that innocents are going to die. In fact, in any contemporary war, you're going to have way more innocents die. This is true of every single contemporary war of the 20th century. There's going to be way more non-combatants killed than military personnel, which was the case if you look at the example on page 197 on what we ought to do, the very beginning of the moral discussion. It seems that World War II ended with the Japanese, American versus the Japanese. That theater of the war ended after the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Within a matter of seconds, 80 to 100,000 people died, which is incredible. And the vast majority of them are non-combatants. And if you look at that, killing thousands of civilians in Hiroshima is morally wrong. On the face of it, that's obvious. The vast majority of people killed were non-combatants. It would be akin to, I don't know, it's a time of war, but it's targeting civilians, a kind of terror tactic. However, we have another intuition that's in contrast with this. Ending the war sooner, World War II, and saving the lives of many other people is a moral good. So one argument is that it was justified, the act of dropping bombs on these two cities was justified because it actually led to fewer deaths, because the war would have continued had this not happened. Now, historians debate this. Not all historians are in agreement as to whether the Japanese were going to surrender prior to the bombing, or they would only have surrendered after the bombing. There's debates about this. Question is it ever acceptable to do that? Is it ever acceptable? Do the ends justify the means in any case, regardless of how horrible the means are to bring about the goal?
Well, isn't it just the argument of the greater versus the few? Like, wouldn't it relate like that sort of argument?
It could be, but it depends on how we frame it. So on 9/11, maybe some of you may not have even been alive at that point, but on 9/11, the morning of 9/11, 4 planes had been used as missiles. They had been hijacked and used as missiles. The order was given to ground every single plane, every passenger plane, and anyone that was still in the air that didn't respond to the F-14 fighter jets that were scrambled into the air The order was given by Vice President Cheney, because that's part of the command structure, to shoot that plane down if there was no response. The assumption was it was hijacked, and it was a missile. And the order was given to actively kill, presumably hundreds of civilians. Why? As you put it, to save more people in the ground. And that's a horrible situation to be in, but we kind of understand the thinking behind it. And it makes sense, because we're potentially saving more lives in the end. But if we take utilitarianism to its extreme, to its logical conclusions, just with Kantian ethics, there are problems. And the surgeon example is one of them. Let's imagine I'm a strict utilitarian, and I'm a surgeon, and I have 4 patients come to my office, all of whom need an emergency surgery. They need an organ transplant. And let's say it's a different organ for each of them, heart, lungs, kidneys, and so on. Then I've got a 5th patient that comes in. These other 4 have family and friends, and they're nice people. The 5th patient is kind of a jackass, doesn't have any friends or family, and he's perfectly healthy. You see where this is going? What should I do as a strict utilitarian surgeon?
Use his organs.
Damn right. Carve him up. Save those 4 people. Yes, 1 dies. Is that murder? No. I was saving these other 4. And if you look at the 4 people I've saved, if you're an average person, you have at least 20, 25 other people who would be horribly harmed by your death. You multiply that by 4, you've increased the amount of happiness or avoided the amount of suffering in the world by killing that 1 person to save those 4.
So the utilitarian, like for the trolley problem, kill that one person instead of the guy or whatever.
That. So, here's that question. I skipped a little bit, obviously. Here's the question you're raising. And it's mentioned in the Roundhead text. And you're familiar with the trolley. In fact, there's a whole cottage industry that has come out of this, so called trolleyology, the study of trolley problems. It's a thought experiment that goes back to 1971 with Philippa Foot, who raises it to show problems with utilitarianism. Here's the first manifestation of that thought experiment, first version of it. That's you, and you're confronted with this dilemma where there's a lever that if you pull it, it will divert that trolley from the track and go off on this route, killing that 1 person. And in doing so, you save this a cappella group here. They're probably not singing. If you do nothing, the trolley continues on and kills the 5. And you know it will kill them. And it's, as I said earlier, it's a thought experiment, and everything in thought experiments dealing with ethics is terrible. Somebody's dying horribly. And if you see, did I mention The Good Place? The show The Good Place? They do a version of this thought experiment. But they're able to actually live it out in a virtual reality where it's real. It's like, all right, what would you do? You have a couple of seconds. Divert the trolley or kill these? And there's blood and guts. It's hilarious, strangely, but awful at the same time. But it's a difficult dilemma here. Yep.
Going back to like the surgeon example, there was actually like a show I was watching a couple of days ago, and it actually had like literally that same sort of example where a girl was pronounced brain dead, and they wanted to harvest her organs, so the doctor actually forged the signature to have her organs harvested. Legally, you're actually supposed to ask the parents.
Yeah.
But she forged the signature. The doctor forged the signature before even asking, so that they can have the organs harvested, and then sent them to patients who actually need them.
Yeah.
Found out, and then those organs were actually taken back because the parents didn't want that to happen.
What?
Because they found out the signatures were forged.
Right.
So at the end, the question was still unanswered. Do you charge the doctor for forgery, and then have those? Because the organs were taken back, all the other patients were actually killed. They didn't survive. So would you charge the doctor for forging the signatures and harvesting organs, or for saving the kids? Because she's actually done this before.
Oh.
She's actually saved other children too.
And why did they take those organs back?
Well, because
It's too late at that point.
It's too late.
Yeah.
Couldn't you also blame the parents too? Because I mean, regardless of like
Blame who?
parents, because regardless of like, yeah, the doctor, what she did was terrible for like forging her signature, but if the parents knew that the organs that were gonna save those people were gonna be taken back and not be used,
Well,
they get in trouble as well.
no, which they weren't even aware of the fact that the organs were being harvested. They
But-
literally just found out.
Well, I know, but that after the fact, they still made the decisions to say no.
Yeah, because they had an emotional connection to the dog.
Like making
The dog
blame
was
them
like,
for killing the people.
Well, I think
Well, they
that's,
didn't get-
I think
it's not
there's
legal.
the opportunity to donate organs, so like if I'm not an organ donor, do I get if I don't want my organs donated? Have their life saved by the mine.
No, I get that, but I'm just like mimicking the fact that the parents know that the organs, like, the decision was already made,
Well,
so I feel like
well,
that's
the
changing
decision was
that.
made by them.
well, it
It'd be
wasn't
different
made
if
by
they
them,
agreed than
the-
disagreed.
The doctor forged the signature without.
I guess I'm not getting the question across right.
Well, I understand.
Yeah, they have some moral responsibility, but not a legal one.
But can't you say because they, yes, they retracted their thing even though they didn't make the decision, they still made a decision to kill those other people that organs were gonna be saved with. Was it their decision?
Yeah, that's why it's morally questionable.
Yeah,
You're right.
it's more like.
Yeah.
It's gonna save people.
Legally
It's
irrelevant, but
legally
morally
irrelevant,
that's
So they
pretty
stopped
fucked
it,
up.
they stopped them, so can you put them all on them too?
I mean, you could, but I mean that's literally how it left the episodes that what,
What's the show?
Law and Order.
Ah. I don't know why I responded that way. I meant, okay, I don't know. Good. So that's a moral dilemma. And on utilitarian grounds, it's not obvious what the answer is. Because with the surgeon, our intuitions are, oh, you can't actively kill somebody because this person's not brain dead. The moral ambiguity there is, I don't think this person's going to survive. And in fact, when Katrina struck in New Orleans, they were in a horrible situation where hospitals who had patients who were on the verge of death, and some would have died certainly because the power went out and there's no way of getting them all out, nurses had to make decisions, real world decisions. We cannot save all of them. There's no way. Sort of what they call triage. As a medic in a military situation, you can see how many people are injured, and you know how much time you have. You have to pick. You have to choose. I can't save all of them. If I devote my attention to this person, I let those die. Is it murder? Well, these nurses got in trouble because they could not help everyone. They chose some that they knew could make it, or they felt could make it, and the others, they gave them a lot of morphine. I don't recall all the details of it, but it's a muddy situation. And this is supposed to clarify, that's what thought experiments are supposed to do, is control for conceptual variables here. And this is absurd, of course, but the point of it is, you know that the trolley is going to kill these people. And somebody's going to die regardless. But if I'm a utilitarian, the calculation is simple. Saving 5 over saving 1 is obvious, and you don't know any of the people yet. That's an interesting caveat. Here we have no idea. There's not enough time to ask, what are your plans for the future? And then pull the lever and say, oh, you made a better case than that one person. You can't do that. You don't know any of the people. Although there was a high school student who wrote a wonderful paper and then tested it related to the thought experiment here. And then there was a philosophy paper written about her paper, because in it she writes, and she asks this anonymously online, what would you do? Would you pull the lever or not? Most people would pull the lever, not knowing who the people were, to save the 5 and allow the 1 to die. Most people do that. The way she framed it is she changed the identities or gave some detail to who the people were. And one of the most interesting one, and awful, was that the individual there is an attractive-looking female, and all these women here are plain-looking women. And that changed fundamentally a large portion of people's responses. And in response to that, what this shows is, the name of the paper related to that is called We're Awful. We're just awful. We're horrible. Because that seemingly irrelevant difference got people to say, yeah, kill them, allow that 1, if that's somebody who's somewhat attractive. But before we finish here, raise your hand. How many would pull the lever to save the 5? Raise your hand. Knowing that 1 would die. How many would not pull the lever and allow the 5 to die? 1 person. Just 1? So I'm afraid you're wrong. Because Philosophy is about majority rules. Do you care to change your opinion now? Okay, why would you not pull the lever?
I'm not sure. That's just my first instinct.
Okay, that's fair
I don't
enough.
have a good answer.
And there's different ways of doing this. And in some cases, you have time to consider it. In other cases, all right, pick. What would you do? Pull the lever or not? Because that's the good place example where there's not enough time. And the moral philosophy professor has to say, no, I can't make the decision that quick. Well, this is a real world scenario. You got to choose. I don't know. And if you know the story, he has a problem making decisions. And by the time he can make any choice, they continually run over the people. It's, as I said, awful, but hilariously done. Our gut intuition is that for most people, is that it's better to save the 5. But if you look at the other alternative approach, see how the difference here? In this case, the consequences are exactly the same. And yet, our moral intuitions tell us, I'm not doing that. But on utilitarian grounds, what reason have you to pull the lever in the first instance, but not heave? This is called the man-heaving version. And you probably have to go
By
with
the way, this needs a better explanation.
Yeah, you'd have to go with the ankles. Okay, the details real quick. Same problem, and you know this dude is big enough to stop the trolley. Okay? You know it. And you also know he's going to die. Because remember, all thought experiments are terrible. They're going to survive, but he's going to die. I know it doesn't look like he'll stop the trolley, but he will. It's not like, oh my God, what if I throw him over? He gets killed, and the trolley just keeps going. How are you going to justify that? You murdered that dude. No, I was trying to save those 5. And I ended up, everyone died. What is the morally relevant difference between the man heaving and the switch pulling?
Because in the switch pull, you don't actually directly use the person. In the man heaving one, you're actually pushing someone onto the track. You're actually throwing someone in directly.
That's true.
There's no difference.
You think that's not a difference? Is it a relevant difference? Because it's true, that is a difference. And it's probably true that psychologically it's harder to do that. It's easy to just go like that.
Your direct
Much harder
action is still
to touch.
causing the death directly.
Because you can imagine there's a switch. Instead of touching him, they just push a button. Or you pull the lever and the man falls through, you see. You're still responsible in that case. What's the difference there?
In one, someone's directly in the line of harm, and you're choosing to save him. In one, you're putting him in harm.
Actually, if you do nothing, he's not in line of harm at all. He's tied to the track. Yeah.
It makes a psychological difference, I think.
Exactly. Now our question is, and that's an important point, does a psychological difference have anything to do with logical or moral difference? What is the difference between these two? And you might say, well, it is easier to do this, but you couldn't use that as a defense, could you? Your Honor, yes, I've been charged with murder, but I didn't touch him. I just did this with my finger. Yes, that's pulling a trigger. You don't get off because you just used a gun instead of your hands, right? I know, and years ago, I'll end with this. I would make the case that it's certainly easier to kill if you're distant. It's easier to drop a bomb than it is to use your hands. It's easier to use a controlling a drone. If you're in 1,000 miles away and kill people. And I had a student in my class who actually worked on drones and did that. And he made the case that it was not easier. So it's not simply a matter of if I'm distant from it, it's it's less of a moral problem, at least according to this one individual. So I had to be cautious in how I frame that. Go ahead.
I mean, I think the main difference is just like the decision making on on the skinnier person's thought, because in the other picture, regardless what he chooses, 1 or 4 or 5 people are gonna die regardless whether the train goes that way or that way. With this one, he makes an actual decision to be like, I'm gonna push you.
Yeah.
I mean, I just feel like the decision making is different on the part of
how many, since everyone chose to pull the switch in the other example, how many would heave the man in this case? A couple. Only a few who are consistent.
I feel like this option isn't as clear right off the bat
No.
than any other situation.
I'll leave you with this. Is this analogous to the order to shoot down a passenger plane, knowing it's going to kill actively and directly innocent people, but for a greater good? There's the key. If I'm a utilitarian, I ought to do that which will bring about the greatest good for the greatest number. Could a utilitarian respond to this or the surgeon example? I'll leave you with that. We're out of time. Keep your answers. Show up next time. There may be a quiz in class. And keep up with the reading.